Out in the oil fields, the pumps never stop. Day and night, the big metal heads nod up and down, pulling what's buried deep out of the ground. Someone has to watch them, a pumper driving a lonely circuit of wells, checking gauges in the dark. But sometimes, the ground gives up more than oil, and the night shift becomes something else entirely. Welcome to True Terror Files Official. Oilfield work is a particular kind of lonely. You drive for hours on empty roads through country that doesn't change, flat desert, frozen tundra, rolling grassland, and you check your wells. You listen to the rhythm of the pump jacks, the hum of the separators, the hiss of gas bleeding from a valve. You get used to being the only human voice for 50 miles in any direction. But every pumper I've ever talked to has a story about a night when they weren't alone. When the gauges showed something they couldn't explain, when the ground under their feet felt wrong, when the silence was broken by a sound that didn't belong to any machine they knew. Tonight, 3 oil field workers share the nights the job became something out of a nightmare. A pumper in West Texas who checked a well that should have been dead and found pressure building from nowhere. A camp attendant on the Alaska North Slope who saw something walking the ice road at 60 below. And a well tender in Oklahoma who descended into a cellar and discovered that some holes go deeper than anyone drilled. Let's head out to the lease. Ezekiel Zeke Tafoya had been a contract pumper in the Permian Basin for 11 years, running a route of 47 wells scattered across 100 square miles of nothing. He knew every pump jack by its sound, the particular wheeze of a worn bearing, the slap of a loose belt, the groan of a gearbox low on oil. Well 37 was a marginal producer, an old well that made maybe 3 barrels a day if the formation pressure was feeling generous. It had a reputation among the other pumpers as a weird well gauges that flickered for no reason, a separator that iced up in August, a persistent smell of sulfur that came and went. Zeke didn't believe in weird, believed in worn-out equipment and lazy maintenance. On a moonless night in February, with the temperature dropping toward freezing and the wind cutting across the flat plain, Zeke pulled up to well 37 for his 2 a.m. gauge check. The pump jack was still. That was the first wrong thing. Should have been running, nodding its slow rhythm like all the others. But the big counterweight hung motionless at the bottom of its stroke, the motor silent. Zeke grabbed his flashlight and his logbook and walked over to the control panel. The breaker was tripped. He reset it. Motor hummed to life, and the pump began its slow, deliberate nodding. Zeke walked to the wellhead to check the pressure gauge. It was an old analog dial, oil-filled, the glass fogged with age. The needle was pegged at 0. It made sense. If the pump had been down, pressure would have bled off. He made a note in his logbook and turned to leave. A sound stopped him. The pressure gauge. It was ticking. Not the steady tick of a clock, a strained, irregular sound, like metal under stress. He turned back and shone his light on the gauge. The needle was moving, climbing 0, 50 psi, 100, 200. Zeke stared. Now the pump was running, but it was pumping fluid toward the tank battery. Pressure at the wellhead shouldn't be building. It should be dropping. The needle hit 500 psi and kept climbing. The ticking became a high-pitched whine. Zeke reached for the emergency shutoff, but before he could hit it, the gauge glass shattered. Not from pressure, from cold. A bloom of frost spread across the broken face of the gauge, and the needle froze solid at a number that wasn't on the dial. A number that had been scratched into the metal casing from the inside. 666. Zeke stumbled back. Pump jack kept nodding, but the sound had changed. It was slower now, heavier, like it was pulling against something that didn't want to come up. And from the wellhead, a voice. Not human something formed from the hiss of gas and the groan of steel, shaped into words that vibrated in Zeke's chest. "Let me up. You've been taking from me for so long. Let me take something back." The ground under Zeke's boots shifted. Not an earthquake, a slow, deliberate undulation, like something massive was rolling over in its sleep miles below. The Kalish cracked in a line that ran from the wellhead straight toward his truck. Zeke ran. He didn't log the pressure. He didn't reset the breaker. He climbed into his truck and drove, the dirt road disappearing under his wheels, the pump jack receding in his rearview mirror. In the mirror, he saw it. The wellhead was glowing. A faint, sickly green light seeping up from the casing, illuminating the nodding beam like a beacon. Zeke quit his route the next day, told the company the wells were fine, but he was done. He moved to Houston and took a job at a refinery where the pipes were above ground and the only thing under his feet was concrete. But he still dreams about well 37, and the number scratched into that gauge, and the voice that spoke from the hiss of gas, asking to be let up. He knows what's down there. He knows the Permian Basin is full of old wells drilled too deep, tapping into things that weren't oil. And he knows that one day something is going to climb out of one of those holes and finish what it started. Cyrus Malloy was a camp attendant at a remote drilling support facility on the Alaska North Slope, responsible for keeping the generators running, the fuel flowing, and the small airstrip clear for supply planes. The camp housed a skeleton crew of 8 during the winter months. When the temperature routinely dropped to 50 below and the sun didn't rise for weeks. Cyrus had been there for 3 months, and she'd grown accustomed to the dark and the cold and the absolute silence of the tundra. Her night checks were simple. Walk the generator shed, check the fuel levels, and make sure the heater in the equipment shack was still running. On a night when the thermometer read -58 and the wind was dead calm, Cyrus was walking back from the generator shed when she saw headlights on the ice road. The ice road was a frozen highway that connected the camp to the main Prudhoe Bay infrastructure, 40 miles away. No one was scheduled to come in that night. No one had radioed. Cyrus stood in the pool of light by the camp entrance and watched the headlights approach. They were moving slowly, deliberately, the vehicle obscured by the cloud of its own exhaust in the bitter cold. It stopped about 50 yards from camp. The headlights cut out, the engine died, and no one got out. Cyrus waited. The cold bit through her parka. She clicked her radio. Camp to unknown vehicle. Identify yourself. Static. She tried again. Nothing. She grabbed a handheld spotlight and walked toward the vehicle, her boots crunching on the packed snow. It was a pickup truck, an older model Ford covered in frost. The windows were opaque with ice. She reached the driver's door and scraped at the glass with her glove. The ice didn't budge. It wasn't on the outside, it was on the inside. She pulled the door handle. It opened with a crack of frozen rubber. The interior of the truck was empty. No driver, no passenger. The keys were in the ignition. The heater was still blowing warm air. And on the passenger seat was a clipboard with a handwritten note. The ink was fresh, not frozen. It read, "Gone to check the well. Don't wait up." Cyrus looked out across the tundra. There were no footprints in the snow. No sign of where the driver had gone. It's just the endless white plain, stretching to a horizon that was invisible in the dark. She radioed the camp supervisor. They checked the truck's registration. It belonged to a pumper named Gerald Meeks, who had worked this section of the slope in the 1980s. Gerald Meeks had disappeared in 1987 while checking a remote well during a whiteout. His body was never found. The truck was impounded and sold at auction. It shouldn't have been here. It shouldn't have been running. Saracen, the supervisor, stood in the cold, staring at the empty truck, the northern lights flickering overhead. And then they heard it. A voice carried on the still air, coming from the darkness beyond the camp lights. Found it. The well's flowing. Get the tanks ready. The voice was cheerful, excited. The voice of a man who had no idea he'd been dead for nearly 40 years. Sowerson, the supervisor, went back inside and locked the door. They didn't go out again until the weak, gray twilight of noon. The truck was gone. The tire tracks led out onto the ice road and simply stopped, as if the vehicle had driven straight up into the dark sky. Sars finished her rotation and never went back to the slope. She works at a truck stop in Fairbanks now, where the lights are always on and the cold is kept at bay by thick walls and a crowd of strangers. But sometimes, on the coldest, stillest nights, she looks out at the dark tree line and wonders if Gerald Meeks is still out there, still checking his wells, still waiting for someone to get the tanks ready. Boyd Fincher was a well tender for a small independent operator in Osage County, Oklahoma, running a string of stripper wells that produced just enough to keep the leases active. These were old wells, some drilled before statehood, their casings patched and their pump jacks held together with baling wire and hope. Well, 14 was the oldest on his Ruta. Well, that had been drilled in 1912, deepened in 1947, and had been making 2 barrels a day of heavy, sulfurous crude for as long as anyone could remember. The cellar around the wellhead was a concrete pit about 6 feet deep, designed to contain any leaks and provide access to the casing valves. It was usually full of dead leaves and the occasional snake. On a humid summer night, with heat lightning flickering on the horizon, Boyd pulled up to well 14 and noticed something odd. The cellar hatch was open. He always kept it closed partly to keep animals out, partly because it was a long fall onto concrete if you weren't paying attention. He grabbed his flashlight and walked over. The hatch was lying to the side, the hinges bent outward. From below, something had pushed it open from inside the cellar. Boyd shone his light down. The cellar was empty except for the usual debris, but the concrete floor was wet, not with oil, with water. Clear, cold water, welling up from a crack in the floor. A crack that shouldn't have been there. Cellar floor was supposed to be solid, a poured slab 6 inches thick. But now there was a fissure running across it, maybe 2 inches wide, and water was seeping up through it. Water that smelled wrong. Not like sulfur or brine, like something ancient, like the bottom of a very old, very deep lake. Boyd climbed down into the cellar to get a better look. His boots splashed in the cold water. He bent down and aimed his light into the crack. It was deep. Deeper than the 6 inches of concrete. It's deeper than the gravel bed beneath. His light disappeared into a void that seemed to go down forever, and from that void a sound. A voice, not words. Sound like singing, but wrong. Tones that vibrated in his chest and made his teeth ache. He straightened up. The water was rising. It was over his boots now, cold as ice, despite the summer heat. And in the beam of his flashlight, he saw something moving in the crack. A hand. Pale. Long-fingered, skin translucent, showing the dark movement of fluids beneath. It reached up through the fissure and gripped the edge of the concrete. Boyd scrambled for the ladder. The hand was followed by another, and then a head began to emerge, a face that was human in shape but not in substance, features flowing and reforming like water over stone. The mouth opened, and the singing became words Boyd could understand. "You've been drinking from our pool for 100 years, taking and taking. Now we're thirsty." Boyd climbed. He pulled himself out of the cellar and ran for his truck. Behind him, he heard the sound of water surging, a geyser erupting from the wellhead. He looked in his rearview mirror as he sped away. The pump jack was still nodding, but water was spraying from the casing, glowing with a faint bioluminescence, and in the spray he could see shapes, things that were not human, not animal, things that had been waiting in a deep, dark place for someone to crack the floor of their world. Boyd never went back to well 14. He told the operator the casing had failed and the well needed to be plugged. The operator sent a cement truck. They pumped 3 times the usual amount of cement down that hole, and it all disappeared. The well was never officially plugged, still listed as temporarily abandoned. Boyd quit the oil field and moved to Missouri, where the ground is solid limestone and the water comes from wells that don't go very deep. But he knows what's under Osage County. He knows that some of those old wells were drilled into things that weren't oil reservoirs. He knows that the crack in the cellar floor is still there, still seeping water. He's still waiting for someone to look down and see what's looking back up. 3 oil fields, 3 night shifts, and 3 encounters with the things that live beneath the wells we drill. Zeke Tafoya watched a dead pressure gauge come alive and heard a voice in the hiss of gas asking to be let up. Source Malloy found an empty truck on an ice road with a note from a man who disappeared 40 years ago, still checking his wells. And Boyd Fincher discovered that some holes go deeper than any drill bit, and the things at the bottom have been waiting a long time to climb out. The oil fields are still out there, thousands of wells nodding day and night across the empty spaces of the country. But the next time you see a pump jack on the horizon, silhouetted against a setting sun, remember that it's not just pulling oil, it's pulling from places we were never meant to reach. Something, somewhere down there, is pulling back. This has been True Terraphiles Official. If you've worked in the oil patch or any remote industrial site and seen something you can't explain, drop it in the comments. Like, subscribe, ring that bell. And if you're ever out on a lease at night and the ground feels wrong under your feet, maybe just get back in the truck.